Drug problems are complicated. Some people might think addictions to substances are just a stupid choice to ruin one's life. Others feel like it's the only way to get even one sliver of happiness in their lives. Some even just use them for fun from time to time and aren't addicted to them. Or is that just what they choose to think to make themselves feel better about the reality of their addiction? How do you fight the illegal drug market? How effective are aggressive strategies like the ones of the US Drug Enforcement Agency? Is legalization the solution to all of this? Even though these questions might not have an answer yet, we can discover a lot about the nature of drug epidemics by looking at one of the biggest drug-related problems in my home country, Switzerland. This problem and the progressive approach Switzerland used made my hometown Zurich and Switzerland world famous. Welcome to how Switzerland tackled the biggest heroin epidemic in history. The year is 1874 and it's a cold winter day in England. And a century before heroin reached Switzerland on a massive scale, English chemist C.R. Alderwright is in his lab conducting some experiments with different opioids that led him to eventually discover heroin. Diamorphine, which would later be called heroin by the pharmaceutical company Bayer, didn't lead to any further developments when Wright discovered it. But 2 decades later, and a few hundred kilometers away in Elberfeld, Germany, a chemist by the name of Felix Hoffmann rediscovered the same substance, and Bayer, the pharmaceutical company he was working for at the time, quickly trademarked the name heroin for the chemical in 1898, and kickstarted the commercialization of heroin as an OTC drug. Heroin was ironically even used to treat opioid addiction. But in the early 1900s, medical professionals discovered the addictive properties of heroin, and the United States of America banned the sale, importation, and manufacturing of heroin. Many countries followed, and the production and consumption rates of heroin plummeted. And at this precise moment, heroin would begin its journey of becoming one of the most popular drugs in pop culture history. The year is 1972. It's a warm spring day in Switzerland, and a 15-year-old boy can see many of his favorite celebrities on TV consuming heroin, and he feels this urge to try it too. His idol is doing it, and his idol is just so cool, so why not? The popularity of heroin is starting to rise rapidly in Switzerland, and Felix Gutzwiller thinks pop culture media had a big influence, also adding that the authorities failed to fully condemn heroin and actually illustrate how bad of a drug it is, so it quickly became very popular among younger people. The data available for the time also shows a correlation. In the 1970s and 1980s, when heroin consumption among celebrities was rising, deaths related to drug use were on the rise as well. Swiss youths also started a rebellion movement around the same time, part of which was the secretive consumption of illicit drugs. But in the 1980s, things changed. Up until the 1980s, heroin addicts weren't very visible. For the government and the general public, heroin and other illicit drugs were a secondary issue. But now that hundreds, thousands of drug addicts came to Zurich to get their stuff and did it in a very visible manner, people started seeing a problem. Especially because most of the people at these larger gatherings weren't even from Switzerland, and all these gatherings were becoming too large for the police to close. This morphed into what we today call the open drug scene in Zurich, and apocalyptic sceneries started showing up all over the news. That had huge effects. One of the two things that bothered the Swiss government the most about this was that most heroin addicts were unable to function properly in society. Heroin is thought to be one of the most addictive drugs on this planet. When heroin enters the human body, it binds to opioid receptors in many different brain regions. This can result in feelings of pleasure, relaxation, pain relief, and more. However, this incredibly high high lasting between 3 and 5 hours is followed by an incredibly low low. On average, in about 1 out of 4 people who try heroin, this makes it impossible for them to go back to a normal state without heroin. Withdrawal symptoms start to show just hours after intake, and sleep problems, diarrhea, vomiting, anxiety, or depression are only a few of them. Difficulty and pressure to get heroin made it impossible for these addicts to lead a normal life in Switzerland. And the second thing was much, much more deadly. HIV and the hepatitis virus is easily spread by sharing used needles, which was common practice for heroin addicts at the time. In the early 1990s, it was the most common cause for an HIV infection, and while there isn't much data on it, empirical data suggests the same for hepatitis infections. AIDS and drugs became the two biggest worries among the Swiss population. In addition to that, pressure from the medical community and politicians eventually led to Switzerland changing their approach to drug policy for years and years to come. Four unique principles: prevention, therapy, harm mitigation, and repression were all largely missing in the Swiss drug policies up until this point. Aggressive measures like the ban of the submission of needles by medical professionals in 1985 or the closing of the so-called needle park in 1992 were the norm. Around the mid-90s though, there were multiple pilot projects going on with these four principles in mind, and in 1994 the so-called four-column policy was introduced on a federal level, and it was used a year later to clear the open drug scene in Zurich. The treatment used to ensure all of those principles were being kept was and still is controlled submission of heroin and withdrawal. Controlled means that the patients were surrounded by medical professionals and helped in a treatment facility. The goal being to give heroin addicts the opportunity of bringing their lives back on track without having additional struggles due to their heroin addiction. There's a clear correlation between the introduction of HAT and a decrease in deaths related to drugs, deaths related to opioids, opioid-related HIV cases, and the general infection rate of hepatitis A in Switzerland. Only in 1995 were the aggressive and repressive measures supported by the four-column policy, rather than being employed on their own, and thus had much bigger effects. The Swiss government was now able to recognize a drug and addiction-free society as the fantasy the data says it is. But a part of the public still believed in abstinence, and in the year 1995, those people sent in an initiative for review with the name of Youths Without Drugs. Its core aim was abstinence, especially in youths, and it wanted the Federal Council to publicly condemn drug consumption and enforce an aggressive and repressive drug prevention policy that strengthens the individual with the least economic and social damages possible. The submission of opioids was explicitly forbidden. At the time, the little science that was available about HAT was methodically not very strong, and partially criticized by some other scientists. But the initiative's supporters didn't care about that. Their stance was simply, drugs are bad, HAT substitutes more drugs, therefore it is bad. Felix Gutzweiler thinks this fantasy of a drug-free society comes from a very religious standpoint, where absolute abstinence is ideal. And Peter Paul Benziger suggests that the supporters of this initiative don't understand how supply and demand work in the drug market, also adding that their notion is very outdated. The Federal Council, the Parliament, most of the major parties, and a whopping 74% of the people who voted on this initiative weren't convinced and voted no. As of July 2021, there were 8 countries in the world that provided HAT, in which there were a total of 58 clinics available for heroin addicts. South Africa and Russia are both examples for countries that have employed very harsh measures to fight their drug problems for decades, yet are still struggling with their own heroin epidemic currently. However, if we want a fairer comparison in which the countries economically and otherwise more like Switzerland, the United States of America are much more interesting to look at. The USA's war on drugs in South America has failed, according to the Global Commission on Drug Policy. This war, which was started in the early 1970s by President Nixon, is, as of January 2022, still ongoing despite resistance from the scientific community, multiple global agencies, and more. The harsh and aggressive methods, in addition to the $1 trillion that were used in this war, resulted in a rise in deaths related to opioids, cocaine, and other illicit drugs, mass incarcerations, and a large rise in drug use. Listen to this. In 2017, 43% of the global deaths related to opioid overdoses were caused by the United States alone. So there is no doubt that the war on drugs in America has been a disaster. Now, if we calm down again, we can see that there remain questions about the conclusion all of the other facts are pushing here. Felix Gutzwiller and Peter Paul Benziger suggest that the radicalness of the measures being taken has a huge influence on the effectiveness of said measures, which could explain why in a few of these countries that have employed HAT, deaths due to opioids are still on the rise. Some people, such as Benziger, even recommend a full-on decriminalization or legalization of the consumption of illicit drugs such as heroin. The effectiveness of measures like these can only be determined by more studies and trials, but I think we'll have a pretty good grasp on the effectiveness of a Swiss-like HAT strategy after we look at how Switzerland is doing today. Last year marked the 10-year anniversary of the heroin-assisted treatment method being officially anchored into the Swiss drug laws, and the situation here has improved a lot since the 1970s. Death rates related to opioids and illicit drugs in the past few years are some of the lowest they've ever been in Switzerland. In 2016, less than 0.1% of the Swiss population said they had consumed heroin in the last 12 months, compared to 7.6% with cannabis and 0.7% with cocaine. HIV infection rates in Switzerland are also at an all-time low. The only open question now is, what about legalization? In 1998, the Federal Council was strictly against legalizing any illicit drugs, but now it's looking like this might be about to change. Pilot projects regarding the legalization of cannabis are scheduled to begin this year, and it's possible Switzerland will want to take the route of legalization as well. But now it's probably about time to wrap this up. Drug policy is a very complex topic, and things regarding drugs change every day across the world. But after looking at this example of liberal drug politics actually working and comparing it to other countries that use more aggressive and conservative methods, I think it's safe to say that the liberal direction we're heading in right now is in this case the right direction. I'd like to end this video on a quote that Swiss Federal Councillor Alain Berset made at a UNO conference regarding drug politics. The human should be in the center, and not the drug.